So you've met Eric and you've met Mike. Next to me is John Mattick, who is the recently appointed, or relatively recently appointed, CEO of Genomics England, which is a very, very interesting, sponsored by the government organisation. And at the end, you've got David Collinson, who is the founder of a company called Pensions Insurance Corporation, I think I said that correctly, which manages £30 billion here in the UK. And when I first met David, which was about a year ago, he only had 10 billion, so he's growing extremely faster, even faster than my predictions on longevity. And so we've got a combination of scientists and financial expert who's going to talk about the disruption that this longevity is going to have on such things as pensions, insurance, and so forth. But I've asked the panelists to start off by talking for 2 minutes about developments in their own individual fields, their areas of specific expertise, about the 1 or 2 things that are going to make the greatest impact to health span and longevity in, let's say, the coming decade. And they've got a couple of minutes each to make that point. So if you'd like to start, John, I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I'm just going to talk about genomics because that's my background, and make 4 points, I think. But the first of which, before I start, is that all the actuarial calculations for life insurance are going to change profoundly because of genomics, and perhaps we'll get a chance to explore that as part of its impact on ageing. The first, so the importance of genomics over the next decade or so is that it is one of the 2 fundamental platforms for personalised and precision healthcare. Up until now, all of medicine and healthcare has been delivered at the average, and of course none of us are average. We all have different genetic risks for different sorts of conditions. So as we introduce genomics into routine healthcare, and you may have seen the announcement from the Secretary of State for Health a week or 2 ago, that the UK is now going to sequence at least 1 million people, and as an aspirational goal of 5 million people over the next 5 years, which is approaching 10% of the population, brackets en route to the whole population, so that personal genomic information is standard part of healthcare. This will, so our major contribution in the short term will be to increase the health span, Jim. About 12% of all people in our society will be hospitalised at some point in their lives because of an incipient, simple genetic condition, such as familial hypercholesteremia. 3 out of 4 people who have that problem genetically are undiagnosed, and they have, on the figures, a 50% chance of having serious cardiovascular event or failure in their 50s. We can pick all of those people up and prevent that from happening. So nearly all of these incipient genetic disorders that some of us are walking around with can be mitigated if forewarned. Secondly, we're now very close to actually getting quantitative handle on polygenic risk for complex diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease, but also cancer, and again, identify the proportion of people in our society are likely to suffer those events and thereby prevent them. And there's almost nobody in this audience that is not going to suffer a serious chronic disorder of ageing. My third point is that with true genomic sequencing, we can start to get the genetic handle on those people who are ageing well. And we've just finished sequencing several thousand individuals who've got to the ripe old age of 80 or more with no sign of any neurodegenerative disorder, chronic disease, cardiovascular disorder, cancer, or anything else. And so we're starting to get a genetic handle on wellness, which will feed into the chemical and pharmaceutical and cellular approaches to improving that. An interesting sidebar is that we can actually tell how old people are just from sequencing their genome without the telomeres, simply because they have accumulated damage. So I think as we have millions, my final sentence, we will, as a society, and the United Kingdom leads this, we might come back to that, we will have millions of high-resolution genetic information on our citizens, matched with millions or billions of data points, not only from clinical records, but from smart devices, which will create the research environment to die for, including understanding what are the genetic determinants that lead to wellness and health span, but also to longer lifespan, which clearly has a genetic basis.
Thank you very much, John. Mike.
What do I think so we can make a big difference in the next few years?
In your field of expertise.
Before I do, I'll just say, the DNA is the blueprint of life, and a lot of people have concerns about being sequenced, a lot of privacy concerns, but I don't know exactly how that's being managed in the UK, but I think that should be the least of your concerns. I think contributing to the knowledge base by allowing your DNA to be sequenced will benefit all of humanity, and I would encourage all of you to feel comfortable with that, having that done. Can I give you a plug there? Is that okay?
Most people do see the value proposition, but I do agree we have to make sure the value proposition is clear,
Yeah.
and that people's rights and privacies are very well protected
Yeah,
by
exactly.
blockchain or whatever.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. So back to the question on, as you might presume, I would point to regenerative medicine, Jim. My reason for doing so, let me just share a little personal story. Eric, you showed the picture of the old pickup truck and the young one, and I was sitting there reminiscing. My father was a international harvester truck dealer, okay? So he served in World War II, and then afterwards came back. We lived near Chicago, and all that commerce, the U.S. had the steel mills in Gary and the automotive industry in Detroit, and he sold trucks for that and repaired them, and we had a parts supply store. So when a truck came barreling along Interstate 94 and a crankshaft broke, my dad would get called in the middle of the night, and we had a parts department, and we could put any new component in that vehicle and get it on the road by the morning so they can ship steel to Detroit. And I worked in this parts department. When I was like 28, my dad died of a heart attack. And man, that was tough. And it bothered me so much that we do all this for these, forgive my language, these damn trucks. But humanity, the people we care for, aren't worth the same amount of effort. So, why couldn't we find a way to put young heart muscle in the person who has lost heart muscle and get them back on the road again? And so what I shared with you is that, well, the good news is science and technology has the ability to build such an industry, and I predict that that's going to make at least a major impact on medicine and health span.
Thank you very much, Mike. So, Eric, out of your lab, what do you see as the most promising? We've seen this analytics, but other stuff that's promising that will be in wide circulation, let's say, in the next 10 years or so?
Well, there's a plethora of targets. I think one thing to really understand is the revolution that happened in the science between 1990 and 2000 paved the way for where we are today. So the mapping of all of these pathways has led to the identification of a number of targets, and these targets are now being engaged therapeutically. And that's one of the two, maybe this is one thing that no one has unified the whole field. If you think about anti-aging or aging prevention, there are two arms. One is to slow down the aging process and these are the interventions that we've talked about, senolytics and so on. The other one is regenerative medicine that Mike exemplified. And I think the two are going to be working in some combinations that we don't know exactly who is going to be doing what, but they're going to be both critical. Now, one area that I'm really bullish about the future is this whole idea of biomarkers of aging. And so this is a big area of emphasis at the PIC right now. The idea is how do we recognize that someone is actually on a good trajectory to live a long life or not? How do we identify the frailty point? Now, you're all aware of your cholesterol levels and your blood pressure. So these are tangible measurements that you can do today and will tell you whether you're on your way to getting a heart attack. We don't have those markers for health span or longevity, except maybe your family history. Having someone in your family live to 100, a first-degree relative, is a really highly predictor that you will do the same. But and that's about 20% of your life expectancy. The remaining 80% is actually environmentally driven. That's the one that you can impact. And so, given this incredible malleability of your own trajectory in terms of aging, there's a lot of interest in trying in people who would be 20, 30, 40 to identify these biomarkers of aging. And to be able to tell you're on a good trajectory, you can just continue like this. If you live a sort of reasonably healthy life, you will be fine, or you're at risk and you have to start taking a drug or an intervention. So I think these biomarkers of aging, we have the first ones. One is called the epigenetic clock. It was pioneered by Steve Horvath at UCLA. It works incredibly well in mice. It is really predictive, and there are now interventions that are able to change the curve, the rate of this marker. But I think there needs to be and biomarkers is not a hot field in terms of investment, unless we are able to generate a really novel biomarker, because it will be used by everyone. So there's a lot of need for investment in this area. I'm convinced this will unleash what we think is a coming revolution in testing a whole series of drugs that we can discuss later.
Fantastic. Okay. So David, we know that if people do live much, much longer than expected, and we also know that insurance companies are taking reserves back into profits at the moment on the basis that longevity in this country and in the United States has sort of plateaued, at least temporarily. Do you think that the pension system is effectively bankrupt? How does the pension system, especially as you said to me earlier, in an environment of very low returns, very low interest rates and stock market returns, how does it deal with this coming wonderment in some ways, but in other ways catastrophe for the financial industry?
I think we've got to start off by looking who is carrying that risk at the moment. So for a lot of the country, the risk is being carried by the government, hence the people through the tax system, where they're relying on state pensions, which give a guarantee of a pension for life. There are about 11 million people in the country who have guarantees for life from their employers or former employers, and it's UK PLC in a sense that is carrying the risk of people living longer. About half of those 11 million are already in retirement. The other half are probably in their 50s, because the vast majority of the workforce in the private sector today, it's they themselves that are carrying the risk of living longer and not setting aside sufficient funds to see them through retirement. So whether or not the state system, the private guaranteed system, or the newer sort of private do-it-yourself system is affected will depend on who and when are going to benefit from increases in longevity. If it's across the board, everyone, yes, the entire system at the moment could be in serious trouble. What's really needed is a transition through to, firstly, redefine the sort of work-life retirement mix that we have at the moment, to really ensure that there is active economic employment possible all the way through to your 80s, which certainly solves the sort of healthier and fulfilled elements of on the poster there. And the other is that there will still be insurance companies or others willing to take responsibility for guaranteeing income levels over lifetimes, because passing that responsibility to manage your finances over to a lifetime of 120 to an individual doesn't work. It has been proved not to work in various areas of retail finance. So it's critical that I think the financial institutions can readjust, if there is going to be a re-rating of longevity, can readjust to a new norm where people are living longer, and that probably means starting giving those guarantees at a later point in life than we have done to date.
Okay, you heard from John as an example that in this country up to 10% of the population is soon to be sequenced or have their genome sequenced, which is fantastic, because I can guarantee if you go to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you'll get two different answers for each time you go to them. On one occasion, I was described as being 75% Afghanistani, as an example, which I think is an unlikely prospect. But would you and your industry, very briefly, start discriminating, or not discriminating, but start triaging people based on the reading of their genomic sequence to determine whether or not you want to take, or insurance companies want to take them on as a risk factor?
Yeah. I mean, I would have thought it would be essential to do that. I think and desirable from a pure risk management perspective, in the same way that you want to look at people with a propensity to crash cars or people who smoke and don't. You want to understand more about the people you're insuring. the key legal point is, are you able to get hold of that information, and are people going to give it to you voluntarily if they know that it's going to cost them more to buy a pension from you?
Well, if they're healthy, it won't cost them more. John, what do you think about that?
I think it's going to be close to the opposite, if I may. So I've been thinking about this for a long time because we've been offering executive wellness genome sequencing analysis for a while. This is in my previous life, not for Genomics England. And we ran up against this issue that people were concerned about their life insurance being. So I thought about it. I thought, well, if we believe our mantra, you're less likely to have a serious event that would impact your employment or your life if you know what that is. So we started talking to the actuaries in the life insurance industry who made the case, which I think they've accepted, although it's not public yet, that if you have information on genomic risk, then that risk is much less likely to be realised. If you have a high risk for cancer, just go and get checked regularly. If you have a high risk for cardiovascular disorders, take statins. Now, I know there are other... So the thing that the industry, I think, is wrestling with, and you see bits of it in the United States and elsewhere, is how to impose mitigation obligations on policyholders. But the idea is fermenting, and I think the political and social optics of this would be extraordinarily powerful. The first life insurance company that comes out and says, we will give you a discounted insurance for giving us your genomic information with a guarantee in writing of no penalty for genetic risk. That will change everything and make people really understand why understanding what's under the hood genomically is important for our health and health of society.
Fantastic. Mike?
I just want to see if Eric agrees with something in this context. And maybe the epigenome, I don't know if all of you know what I mean by that, but the DNA encodes as the blueprint of life, but sort of decorated on that strand of DNA are molecular alterations we call the epigenome. It's not part of the ATCG sequence, but it's but still affects the blueprint of life. And that epigenome is where the Horvath clock is so predictive. The scary part to me was how predictive it is of even all-cause mortality. What predicts your time that you'll die within a couple of years.
Yeah.
So if that can be read off, not just the DNA sequence and the risk factors of cardiovascular, do you agree that could potentially really derail
Before
how we think
you
about
do that, I want to ask you a question, Eric, because everyone in this audience has a self-interest. The reason that I'm so optimistic about this industry, that there's not a single person on the planet who isn't a potential client for the therapies related to a sort of juvenescence approach. Let's ask you the question as one of the key scientists in this field. When will these products, even if they're primitive, like the early senolytics or the rapamycins or whatever, when will they become available to everyone in this room?
Well, it's very hard to predict.
Just give us an idea.
If you think, if the normal trajectory of drug development, the senolytics, for example, entering the clinic actually last month, it takes probably another 5 to 10 years from there to actually get an approved drug. However, this doesn't say anything about the drugs that are already available today that a lot of people in the field are self-experimenting with. And I'm thinking about metformin, I'm thinking about nicotinamide riboside. There's a whole series, a whole industry of drugs that are, rapamycin actually is, some people are self-experimenting. There's, pluses and minuses in this. You're taking a risk because these drugs have not been tested, but I can tell you a lot of people in the aging field actually have jumped on this. So I think there's a lot of information that is percolating. A lot of people, I started an informal survey with all of my colleagues in the aging field to try to see who's taking what. And it's actually remarkable that many of us are taking some of the same.
Are they all still alive?
All of them alive, actually, many of them doing quite well.
That's great.
One more word about the biomarkers of aging, because I think we've heard about the genome, we've heard about the epigenetic clock. I have a number of friends in the tech industry. I can tell you, you will never know as much from your genome as we know from your Facebook account. So if you're worried about privacy, they can predict your lifespan, they can predict everything from your Facebook and your online presence. So if you're worried about privacy, I would say the genome is not the place to be worried, and it's everything else. The amount of information that these companies are able to extract out of your face, out of your picture, There are new algorithms that can actually predict your biological age just from your face. And so I would say that's where the big privacy issue lies. And
check out young.ai, which is
yes.
Alex Zakharonov's
Alex Zakharonov is right here.
contribution to this particular thing. David, you were trained as an actuary, so presumably in the Gompertz curve theories and all that sort of stuff, and the actuarial tables of 1947, which still persisted for a long time, right? Do you believe yourself that these therapies are going to work and have a biological impact on human beings? And is it adjusting your view of your own business?
I certainly believe that the longevity will change and improve. What I'm not certain of is, will that be a continued trend or a step re-rating? You know, are we just going to carry on doing that, or are we going to do that? Because carrying on doing that is fine, because everyone can adjust. We can gradually adjust to assuming people are living longer and longer, and every new cohort that comes through, we can price slightly differently. It's when there's that sort of step jump that could be painful for certain individuals, could be painful for individuals or individual institutions if they're left holding a lot of longevity guarantees that they haven't laid off to other parties.
Okay, so John, your work in genomics is very interesting because it's effectively government-backed. Now, we read every day about how the NHS is creaking at the seams and there's not enough money. There will never be enough money for the NHS, let's face it. But do you think that your work, and it's the alliance with precision medicine, is going to result in people actually having a compressed period of morbidity? In other words, having less time being sick and demanding resources from the overstretched NHS and other health systems. Do you think that it's possible that in 10 or 20 years, rather than spending 10% of GDP on, most of which is spent in the last few years, that percentage could come down, and we might be more like Hong Kong, where 5% of GDP is spent on healthcare, and yet it has the highest life expectancy in the world? Do you think that's a possibility?
Short answer is yes.
Okay, can you make it a slightly longer answer, not too long?
That's what we're aiming for. I think the very big challenge for all of us, but particularly the system, is how to constructively, use that word advisedly, segue from an industry that's based on crisis management to an industry that is based on health wellness management. We're going to die, I think, at least in this next century or so. Most of us would like to think we just go to sleep quietly one night when we've had a good and full life. I think that's possible to extend the health span close to the lifespan. But there are big challenges in the NHS in particular, as magnificent an organisation as it is, and the whole of the structure of the healthcare system to move from crisis management to health management.
So, Mike, in, say, 2050, what is your view of human life expectancy?
I have no idea. What I'll say,
well,
though,
do you think you'll be alive in 2050?
No, I'm a terrible futurist, but I can predict some scientific trends. At least I think I did. Well, let me just say, it's easier to look back. And I was sitting down. I showed the picture of the young and old cells, and that was the work of a scientist named Len Hayflick. We call it the Hayflick limit. He's considered the father of modern cell aging research. And I sat down with him maybe a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the telomerase thing, that one gene immortalizing cells, and reprogramming, cloning and reprogramming, where we can take a cell all the way back to the beginning of life and all this, and then embryonic stem cells and turn them into all these cells and so on. And Len's been around a long time, and I said, Len, when you entered the field of aging research, did you ever imagine in your life that you would see these kinds of breakthroughs, that you could stop the aging of cells, that we could take a cell back in time and so on? And adamantly, he said, never in my wildest dreams that it would ever happen. Not 2050. He's talking about 250 million years from now. He never saw it coming. And I think the best lesson we can learn from history is expect unexpected rapid change in this field.
So what would make you happiest, Eric, for the buck to accomplish in your tenure there? Would it be the development of drugs, or what sort of impact on humanity would you really like to leave behind when you eventually, in 2050, leave? The gold watch is awarded.
I think we're as I mentioned, in the transition phase, where even the problem and the possibilities are being realized. And so this decade, I think, will really be looked at as hopefully the first decade where a true anti-aging medicine will have been approved. I think we're on our way with the Senolytics and Unity to become the first ones to have this. The prediction is that this will unleash a much bigger excitement than we have today. And the excitement is already there. So I think that would be, from my tenure, the next 10 to 15 years, to really place the buck on a trajectory where it is the leading organization that drives this revolution. I think that's one thing. That I'll add one thing. One of my biggest worries in this area is the increasing discrepancy between education and no education, have and have not. Or one of the strongest predictors in the U.S. right now of your of your lifespan is your zip code. And so lifespan in the U.S. can vary depending on where you live. You can expect to live from 67 to 87. I happen to live in an area in Marin County where life expectancy is 87 on average today. Further down the valley, there are some communities where life expectancy is 67. I think so this is one example of the things that worries me. We know today that smoking is really one of the highest risk factors for death. And despite this knowledge, we're not able to implement the changes in society that would actually make or encourage people to stop smoking. So there's a discrepancy that I am concerned will grow between what we can do and what we are actually doing. So understanding human psychology, the factors of motivation, the fact that 15% of people exercise, when we know it is the strongest anti-aging medicine that exists today, to me is, again, another aspect that is not talked about. Everyone is waiting for the miracle drug. We have much of the arsenal to make most people live to 100 today available. And so so the Buck's mission is going to be playing a really leading role, not only in just generating the drugs and creating biotech. We're going to be doing this, but I really would love for us to become a powerhouse behind the mentality and addressing the federal dollars where they should go. People motivation is a huge factor that's going to drive this revolution.
Okay. David, just one last question for you. People, if they live a very long life, are going to have to save harder and more, presumably. What's your recommendation to younger people in the audience about their saving pattern?
It would be to save some, but look more holistically about your savings, because probably the biggest wealth generation saving that you can make would be to invest in re-education, so you can constantly change what you're doing and dramatically extend your working lifetime. That's both an interesting and economic way. So you've got pure savings just to pay an income, and you've got savings to do something that will change you to enable your longevity in working life to be a lot longer.
And so, John, I've got one last question before I open the floor to the audience before lunch. All of us have heard about genome sequencing. Can I ask the audience how many of you actually have had your genome sequenced? Oh, quite a lot. Quite young ones as well. Where do the rest of us go to get our genome sequenced? What would you recommend?
Genomics England.
Genomics England. Do you do it for free?
No. No, we do it for free for people who are ill, because that's the NHS's mission as a clinical service. But without being too facetious about it, we will be developing a volunteers program. What I would like to achieve in the next year or three is to have Genomics England seen as not just the UK's, but the global point of trust in genome analysis. Genome sequence is just 3 billion AGCTs. What you want to do is be able to analyse it at scale. It's evidence-based, it's well curated, continuously updated. So the information you give back to citizens or to their physicians, and I think primary care is going to be where most of the value is realised, is gold standard, ISO-accredited, evidence-based. And if we can provide that, then we can provide to everybody in this room and beyond quality information that's at the state of the evidential art in terms of genome analysis, and also open up pathways for volunteer into the system as we get up to speed. The costs will continue to come down, and that'll make it easier, of course, but we're on the journey to revolutionising healthcare both personally and systemically.
Right. My co-founder, one of my co-founders of the forum, Anthony Chow, is now going to, I suppose, relay the questions from the audience to our panelists.
That's it. So Bled and Rees of the European Connected Health Alliance has a question for the panel as a whole. Has anyone done any health economic analysis on the reduction in health and care costs versus any increased, sorry, someone's just posted another question and it's moved. Any increased cost for increases in health span?
Okay, would you want to do that, Eric?
I just mentioned Jay Olshansky is a leading health economist in the US who has actually calculated what the implications of even modest reductions of health care costs due to this revolution. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but I'm happy to share with you the papers that he has published. The point of view that he is taking is actually even minimum increase in health span will have dramatic effect on our social security systems in the US and in the Western
Better or
world.
worse? Up or down?
Up.
Better or worse? Will it cost more or cost less?
Less.
Right.
So it's actually the prediction is that this is actually the only way for these systems to survive in the long term.
Right, Anthony?
Caleb Culverwell, to what extent could a major economic correction impact the pace of investment and acceleration within longevity research?
Okay, so do you want to, that's kind of a double-sided question, both scientific and financial. Do you want to address that, David?
Not really sure, actually. The world is awash with money at the moment, and people looking for a home, where a major financial correction could stop that, could slow into all investment areas.
But major financial corrections are brief and fleeting, and our lives are long, so we should be optimistic.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Anthony?
Question from Damien. Eric, what percentage of your colleagues have tested some of the available senolytics?
I would say none. There's only one combination called quercetin and a chemotherapy drug. So I would say if one of my colleagues had tested this as an anti-aging therapy, I would probably call them crazy.
Would they lose their job?
No, you can actually do whatever you want if you get someone to prescribe it for you. But senolytics are actually much more experimental. That even the company Unity that has generated senolytics is testing them by injection in the knee, and next step will be injection in the eye. And I think the reason for doing this is we do not know in humans what is the risk of global senolysis. And so, and one of the things that actually we have to consider as we move in the future, when people consider interventions in aging, we are not treating people who are sick. So there's a threshold for risk tolerability if you're treating a person who has a 2-year expected lifespan versus someone who's expected to live another 30 years. And I think this is one aspect that I think gives me a bit of pause in terms of how fast these interventions will be rolled out in humans, because there is a need first, do no harm. That is the Hippocrates oath that most doctors, that all doctors actually take, and I will actually ponder the speed at which some of these modifications can be.
So, Mike, do you take anything yourself?
No. Baby aspirin, because my dad died of a heart attack. That's
Right.
it.
But would you consider taking something relatively soon?
Yeah, a lot of these compounds have been well understood in like in mice and other rodents, but I don't have the confidence that a lot of the animal data predicts human outcomes. So.
All right. Well, Laura.
What percentage of your colleagues are taking metformin? Aaron?
A lot.
Okay.
A lot. So metformin, just a word of background, is one of the most prescribed drugs actually today in the world. It's an anti-diabetic drug. It's called Glucophage in continental Europe. I don't know how it's commercialized in the US. A study was looked at the survival of diabetics on glucophage and compare them to second and third generation anti-diabetic drugs. And the idea of this study was to see, is glucophage, which is about 100 years old and is very cheap, is it doing better or less well than more expensive novel anti-diabetic drugs? The thing that came out of this study was completely surprising. It turned out that diabetics on glucophage lived longer than non-diabetics. And we know that diabetes is a risk factor for early complication that we've seen. So this suggested that maybe metformin had anti-aging properties. And so a colleague of mine in the field, near Barzilai at Albert Einstein, is in the process of raising money to conduct a large-scale trial in humans to give metformin to non-diabetic. And a lot of people in the field have jumped on the bandwagon and started taking metformin, hoping that it will. It's an extremely safe drug. It turns out that a large fraction of the population, once you reach 60, is pre-diabetic already. And so that's really one of the first ones that we are likely to see the result of.
And take it at night with vitamin B12.
Yes.
And buy it in Spain, it's over the counter and it's €4 for 100 pills. I know, because I've small. John, this is the last question, and this relates to government spending. The United Kingdom is a world leader in science. It's the second ranked, I would say, in this pro-longevity space or aging research space after the United States, which is clearly the dominant factor. We have an opportunity in this period of political turmoil to make ourselves even more of a leader. What would be your recommendation to the British government in terms of funding and where the money should go, and what areas specifically, if you had an unlimited checkbook, would you want the checks to be written for?
Jim, the way I'd like to answer that question is this. And I've been around government and industry for a long time. There are a lot of pressure on budgets. There are A&E queues in the health system, there's new roads to be built, etc. What I would encourage is for the government to decide what proportion of the national spend it invests in the future and making a better future, and what proportion it invests in looking after the present. Because those two things are colliding at the moment in not very productive ways. You want to, and you've seen a big increase in the budget for the NHS, which is overdue. It would be terrific if 8%, pick a number, 3 or 5%, was partitioned for improving healthcare strategically, and 95% or so for reducing the A&E queues. I think that's the most sensible way to do it for governments and companies to decide what they invest in the future and what they use to improve the present. If that was done, I think we'd have a much better strategic approach to building a better system here, and a much better strategic approach to making sure the UK leads the world in this area.
Okay, well, tell your MPs, tell your political contacts, tell everyone you know who can influence policy. I want to thank the 4 panellists today, who I think have been incredibly interesting. They are going to be here for both lunch and for drinks after the afternoon sessions, and I urge you to take advantage of having all these wonderful people in the same place on this first Longevity Forum. Thank you very much indeed.